and welcome to the Narrator Roundtable. I'm Deanna Anthony, one of your co-hosts today, and I'm joined by fellow co-host Kirt. What's up?
Hey, I'm excited to chat about this.
Gail Shalan. Gail, what's going on?
I'm good. Happy to see you.
Awesome. And Lindsey, Dorcus. Hey.
Hello.
All right, so romance and I go way back. I have a Harlequin history. I've read everything by Julia Quinn, including the original Bridgerton series that I just binged last night on Netflix, which was amazing. But I've read those books multiple times. And whether it's an ebook, paperbook, hardcover, or audiobook, film or TV, daytime or nighttime, I am in it, okay? So I was absolutely thrilled to no end when I discovered that my assigned mentor through the APA DEI mentorship program was Mary Jane Wells, because when I said she does it, she does it. Okay, people? So she's a 3-time Audio Award winner, 9-time Earphone Award recipient, and a narrator of over 200 audiobook titles. So Mary Jane is an actor. She's a writer, a brilliant writer, actually, and a voiceover artist that has also worked in film, TV, and commercials. She produces quite often and is working directly with independent authors, has written and performed her solo show called Heroine at the Kennedy Center, y'all, in Washington, D.C. And that's just the tip of the iceberg because, you know, she's doing all that producer work, too, with the publishers. So not only is she my mentor, she's now also my friend. And I'm so excited to have you here, MJ. I said I wasn't going to say that because that's what I call you, but it's Mary Jane, y'all. Her name is Mary Jane.
That's very kind. And thank you. Thank you for such a glowing introduction. Even with that massive lie in it, which is you're secretly actually not needing any kind of mentor at all. And we both knew by session 4 that you knew far more about the industry than I did. And I was just sort of bicycling in the air, trying to vamp, trying to think of something else that you might know, but no. So I'm delighted to be in that category, but we both know it's a lie.
Oh, please. I mean, seriously, I learn something from you every day. And y'all, I finally get to narrate with her after years. So I'm so excited to be part of historical fiction with you. And seriously, every time we talk, though, I learn something from you. Like, even though we're not officially still in that phase, you know what I'm saying? And so thank you. But for real, though, you have the cred. And I'm so blessed to know you.
Thank you. Well, likewise. Absolutely. I feel exactly the same. I'm trying to think of some of the wisdom. Like if I dry up, I'll be like, never corner an angry swan. Did it. Got it. Finally dropped the pearl of wisdom today.
All right. So before we jump in and get started, I just want to take a moment to inform everyone who's listening and watching that we are going to discuss some of the great, the put upon and the why and the what aspects of romance, right? The romance genre, as well as some of its subgenres. And so even though this is audiobook focused, it's going to get into some world stuff, right? It's going to get into some live stuff. So this is a content warning in relation to contemporary, historical, mafia, suspense, dark romance genre subject matter, and it may not be limited to. So just get ready. But let's start with HEA, right?
Right.
For those who don't know, HEAs are happily ever afters. And for a lot of people, this is the absolute defining factor of what makes romance. So I'm just going to open this up, starting with you, Mary Jane. What is the technique you use as an audiobook narrator to kind of define the points that lead up to that moment, right? Because this is really what we're getting at most of the end of these romance stories. So what is that like for you?
I think that's about the handling of tension. Because in order to keep your listeners with you, you are saying a lot of the time in romance, there's a pattern, but the slight deviations from the pattern, the kind of dark night of the soul, the moment where one of them gets wounded and the other has to tend, the moment where, you know, and even in historical romance, there's much more modern memes and tropes about, well, actually, maybe we don't want to be married or we don't want to be in a long-term relationship, but there is a happy ever after in it. I think it's keeping the tension and the subtext going, so that you are taking the listener by the hand, present with each of those plot points, so that we can really relax and settle into the quick slide home, because it's problem, obstacle, get over obstacle. Oh, have a little bit of connection. Oh, no, but it's fated not to be. Oh, what is it? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. And then finally you get the ending where we get the satisfying happy ever after. But it's got to be a kind of relief and a release, because we haven't, well, of course we know it's coming, but the deliciousness is in the tension of playing that it isn't.
Yeah.
So staying present, I think.
Yeah.
So investing in the moments where, oh, it's not going to work.
I like, the deliciousness of the moment. I like that. Like, as a reader and listener, and it even shows up in my narration, I love firsts. That first like meet cute, that first maybe touch or brush or, hand, and definitely that first kiss. Like, I don't know, like I just get excited about it in those moments for the characters. So, since that's something that I enjoy as a consumer of the content, I like to also put that into the work. How about anybody else?
I think Mary Jane said subtext, which was going to be my answer, because I think that is such an important part of conveying the emotion of the story. And without emotion, all of those beats that we're used to are like structural part of the story. And let me tell you, when they're not there, you feel it, because a story without conflict, regardless of the genre, is hard to be invested in. But it's in the subtext. It's often in what's not written, but what the reader and what we as the narrators are tasked with bringing to the story, understanding what might be going on underneath. That, I think, is part of what makes stories really exciting and accessible. But you have to emotionally invest yourself as a narrator in these people and in their story if you're going to be the conveyor of their story to an audience. And so understanding that there are parts of stories, and not all the time, because sometimes it's like very close third person or first person where they're just telling you everything. Subtext, we don't know her. They're saying it all out loud. But oftentimes you have to read into what's not being said to bring that human element to the story. And then that makes it feel authentic and real. And it makes the payoff at the end so much greater.
I love the way you talk about conveying a story, because we all know, I think, especially with these kind of stories, or maybe every story actually, in narration is, I don't even like the word performance, because it implies a distance or a putting on of something. It is a sharing of something. So you're not really reading or narrating a book, because I think that predisposes a listener to think that they're subject to it. I think you're sharing it, and that's what you were just talking to me about, and I love that.
Something about the HEA that makes romance so special. I think every book, to an extent, is a bit like a roller coaster, right? In that, like, you get the thrills and you get the chills, but you're safe the whole time because it's fiction. You can sort of like live out these fantasies or these fears or these whatevers in this safe environment because it's not actually happening to you in real life. And romance just takes that to another level with the happily ever after, because you are guaranteed going in, you are guaranteed a soft landing, which I think is great, because then it lets you really hit those super high stakes throughout the story, like really lean into those twists and those turns and those lows and those highs, because you and the reader both know, like, we're going to land in a safe place. So I think like that's part of the magic of the genre.
I like that
It is
a lot. So even thinking about, the safety of it, like this space that's being created while the story is being shared, it really kind of falls in line with everything that I kind of was really thinking I wanted to touch on today. So the first thing I'd like to bring into it is, in my personal experience, when I was reading those Harlequin romances, nobody even close to my lived experience was in it. Nobody looked like me. Nobody sounded like me, because they were all historical romance with a ton. So Identity and representation. This is a huge thing, and I see it
Yeah.
across all genres. I had somebody ask me about romanticy specifically because they didn't really have an experience with people of color being in these stories, and they wanted to know if that was even like a thing. And I was like, yeah, most definitely it is a thing. And it's a subgenre, like so many of these subgenres, that if we're not part of the community or we're not consuming this material, we have no idea that there's decades worth of material where this genre has been living like under the mainstream. So I would love to know um, some of the stories, that have the identity representation that's kind of maybe outside of the margins of what most people think of when they think of traditional romance.
That's a brilliant question and so prescient, I think, because romance, and certainly the books I've been cast for, and certainly within my realm of experience, has been incredibly mainstream because of how I self-identify. And it feels to me like it's a little slow to catch up with the rest of the world as a genre. And the interesting thing is when you work with indie authors, some people are writing from a perspective in there. They've got time and maybe a little bit of extra money to write, so they're over 50, and without wanting to categorize or make sweeping statements, I probably am just about to make a few. So I apologize if they're terrible, but I find that it's really challenging working with indie authors who come to me and say, "Hey, so I'd like you to do this book," and I read it and I go, so let's split the chapters up so that your Venezuelan doctor or your Indian doctor can be voiced by somebody who would never usually be considered for these roles, and that we share it. So it's not also tokenistic, but we're being correct. And they always come back with not always, but sometimes come back with an eye roll about political correctness. And I'm like, I don't think of course it's political, but not in the way you're saying. It's just correct. Like, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I have had to turn down an awful lot of work because, not necessarily because they wouldn't be flexible about those when you talk to them in the right way and why, but what they're trying to say about those characters is often extremely problematic. And I've just had to walk away because you can't ask an author to have different values and want to put a different message into the world. That's certainly not my job either. So it's a hot topic. Courtney Milan did a lot of good work with that, with saying, hey, all the awards are going to heteronormative, whitewashed casting books. And it's time that stopped. It's time we made some room, and it wasn't a subcategory anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. You know how you were saying, it's just correct. That, like, the minute you said that, like, in the back of my mind, I was like, yeah, like, a microaggression is not tiny, it's just aggressive. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
sometimes the words we put on things and the ideas behind them uh, get lost in translation and we miss the point. So yeah, I really appreciated that. And it's interesting because this is me just only talking from the independent authors that I know that do write outside of what would be considered mainstream. And they've been doing it for years. Some of them started writing when they were in college and things like that, and never published until the indie market kind of had the boom that it had, and it kind of made sense to try it and see. And it's very grassroots, and it's very homegrown, and it's very interconnective and direct, right, with the listeners and consumers and readers of whatever it is they're putting out. Has anybody else had any experiences with what I'm going to say are new identities and representation, but maybe I should say just now recognized? since they've been here.
Yeah.
Well, there's an interesting tension when it comes to, writing queer characters in romances, because it's almost all fantasy in a sense, because many of those romances take place in worlds where like homophobia is just not an issue, including ones that are written like lovely books that I really enjoy, but that they're written at a Regency romances or Victorian romances, and it's like, this is so cute, but like, no, this wouldn't have been allowed. like like the conflict of the story would not have been like, oh my god, does he like me? Like the conflict of the story would have been like, I might be beheaded if I express my and so there is this tension when it comes to telling inclusive stories, but wanting to include people who didn't have the freedom to be themselves or didn't have the rights of the people who are typically being written about when it comes to things in the past and even like modern day. Like a lot of romances kind of set aside the struggles that marginalized people still deal with in order to tell a fulfilling and satisfying love story.
It's interesting how far we can forgive in that, in order to experience that fantasy, which really is culturally and personally important for somebody to have written about it, where there aren't those boundaries, there aren't the same memes or just the same dynamics in society to have to fight through. Sometimes they're used as great plot points, right? We're not allowed to do this, so underneath we do. But when there's none of them there at all, I wonder what that story has to have for people to forgive the lack of nod to history. I think it's really useful to not have to do that, and important somehow.
Well, and it can be healing too, to read those stories and to be able to identify with a character who doesn't have those struggles. So I understand the impulse to write them and to read them. But again, I keep saying tension because it's a balance. It's a tension. You got to figure out there like every book can't be that, like, because then we'll start giving people the wrong idea about where marginalized people have been in history and where they are today.
Gotcha.
So it's nice to have the fantasy.
Yeah.
Just like it's nice to have dragons in books sometimes. Sometimes it's just fun.
Exactly. Yeah. Fantasy works when there's well, they say this about all different genres as well. Like, to tell a story, to tell the truth, you need to include a bit of fiction to really tell it accurately. And that's true of documentary, that's true of drama. But I think that's especially true of fantasy, because we're saying to everybody, we're going to go to somewhere where all the rules are different. But there has to be enough rules to keep us there. And I suppose some of what you're talking about might push people out because they want to make sure that their experience is identifiable all the way through, or in particular areas. I don't know. I guess it must be personal.
Or that the fantasy can remain a fantasy. Because, I mean, we're talking about identity, but also situationally, like we're going to talk about this. Like, there are books where people are put in situations that would be horrible to actually live through, but it's turned into a romance.
Gosh.
Right.
Right. So that's the
Right.
the sort of moving territory of representation into fetishization, right? Or like fantasy into fetishization. I don't know. I have so many unstable feelings about all of that. Like, my studio is working on a series right now with many different female main characters. All are neurodiverse, and it's exploring like and it's erotica. Like, I happily ever after doesn't really matter in these. Like, and it's exploring that part of the neurodiverse experience in a way that sometimes feels like it's representative, and sometimes feels like it's fantasy, and sometimes feels like it's objectification and fetishization. And it's very, I feel a whole bunch of ways about it because I'm like, I want that out there. And I also don't know how I feel about this part of that. And like, I don't know. So I'm curious what you all feel about that.
No, this is interesting. Let's jump into this because like we're really talking about world building, right? Because there is that fantasy element in romance, and yes, erotica as well. you know, the funny thing is like, if you break it down to its basic points, everybody's experience is individual, even though collectively people can have similar experiences in the same room, in the same family, in the, they're just going to be slightly different. So someone else's fantasy could be someone's reality that we're just not aware of. Do you know what I mean? So let's talk about that a little bit, right? Like the responsibility and the rights of the author, in the research that they're doing or not doing, and exactly how they're conveying things. Is it this thing of exploring something that you find to be exotic because it's not part of your lived experience as an author, and that's why it's coming through in the writing? Like, yeah, let's just go ahead and dive into that part of it, that part of the fantasies that basically sell romance in erotica, in my opinion. Yeah.
This is so rich. I almost don't know where to start with it because it's such a huge part. I am always well, you've mentioned many things. I'm just going to try and order my thoughts. But I think when you hit across what you said about, I think erotica and romance have this really interesting role, like as a barometer of where we are in society. And I think that we are surrounded by culture which is pornographizing a lot of things and passing it off as pop culture. And I feel like when we sit and watch Netflix, I know this is a different genre, but it's like, sexual assault, murder, 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 sexual assault, furniture, murder, 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 sort of thing. And and in studios as well, they have this test that they do, or they use this neuroscience. So it's about when we're watching a story and we want to engage an audience for as long as possible, it's about the delicate balance between cortisol and oxytocin. So, oh, I'm so worried for that character that I have to keep watching to see if they're okay. And oh, I really like that character and I'm getting a lovely fuzzy hit. So it's that balance that keeps us going. And I feel like we're going somewhere more and more. I mean, I didn't think I was so conservative as a person, but more and more I'm worried about what passes off as normal. And I think that's also why it pushes me towards romance with a safe, happy ending. And I don't do any erotica, so I don't know. I'd be really interested to find out what shadow side of us is being played out healthily in that, and what part of it is pushing us further towards weird, misogynistic, objectifying, yucky stuff.
Yeah,
God,
right.
that's the whole thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where's the line?
Yeah. And what is consensual, cool kink stuff, and what is so far into objectification that it just makes you feel ick. And for some people, that's what they're into. And like, it gets really into the nitty gritty of, as you were saying, Deanna, the individual experience. And I think like what I'm thinking about is what are the moments in these stories that humanize and what are the moments that dehumanize? And what is the consensual context around those humanizing or dehumanizing moments?
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about the fantasy of it, right? We've talked about, is it porn? Is it pop culture? I love that. And we've kind of touched on what might be someone's kink, right? And are there lines? And if there are lines, like where are they? And what determines that? I mean, it's kind of hard, right? Because I think that is very individual. However, I go back to kind of like the start of the conversation where we were talking about safety, safe spaces, you know, for whatever your experience is going to be, for whatever the romance or erotic genre is. So, in that safe space, what about sex positivity, right? I mean,
Mm.
not all romance has sex in it, but I would say the majority of romance does, and all of erotica does. I think, right? I don't
Sure
know of an
does.
erotic subgenre that doesn't have some kind of sex.
I mean, unless you're thinking of like Chuck Tingle's asexual Pounded by No One books, which
okay, specify
Denial credible.
because
Yeah.
We love an inclusive king.
Yes.
You know, it's really interesting because I often talk about like I come from a pretty conservative background. I grew up Catholic. I often say if I wasn't gay, I probably would have been a Republican. So thank God. But doing this work has opened my eyes to so many different types of relationships, of kinks, of things like polyamory and open relationships, things that I used to judge really harshly. Like I used to be one of those people who thought there is a right way to have a relationship and a wrong way to have a relationship. And there are right kinds of sex and bad kinds of sex. And doing this work has forced me to confront a lot of those feelings. And I'm so glad. I'm so glad that there were times when the books I was reading made me uncomfortable. But because of the work I was doing, going back to what we said at the top, having to identify with the people and put yourselves in those situations and make it real for yourself, it made me go, oh, this is also a valid expression of love. This is also a valid expression of sex. And so there are wonderful parts of doing this type of work that sometimes challenge your preconceived notions.
That's fantastic because it shows as well that you don't have to actually experience something to really learn from it. You know, you can ghost the experience and go, whew, and like you say, completely grow. I'm the same. I think I came to certain things with a lot of judgment, and then, you know, those books knocked it out of me, fortunately.
Yeah. Books are windows, not mirrors.
And interestingly, Deanna, you were saying, you know, what maybe one person's delight is another person's horror kind of thing, just depending on perspective. I think the particular thing about audiobooks also is that, you know, we're looking for consent, obviously, with these things, and not coerced, enthusiastic, ongoing. But audiobooks are different because you're inside both people's heads in a way that, you know, if consent goes wrong and you're in a law, you know, in the court of law, you can never do that. It's about the, you know, in life, it's about the verifiable, guaranteeable, easily understood, reasonable assumption of it. But in the audiobook, we can go with something, perhaps at times when those signals are not underlined, because we've been in her head or we've been in his head, and we know they're absolutely gagging for it.
So there's consent between the author, the narrator, and the listener in that situation, right? Because there's an explicit agreement that everybody's on board, because we've heard somebody say that even if they haven't said it out loud.
It's funny because I don't do a lot of really dark romance just out of personal preference. I've turned down a few books like that because I personally would struggle to live in and inhabit that world. For me, it's like the combination specifically of like non-consent or violence with like the happily ever after is the really tough part. Like I do some pretty gnarly horror and I can do that, but this for me personally. But whenever I encounter those books in the wild or like think about them existing, the way I think about it is like, okay, the characters in that book are fictional. None of the characters are getting hurt because they don't exist. The real people involved are the listener or reader, the author, and the audiobook narrator. And the author's consenting because they're writing every word. They can stop writing at any moment. The listener can stop listening at any moment. Hopefully that book has been marketed correctly and they know what they're getting into. But even if it crosses, like they can withdraw their consent at any time by shutting it off or closing the book. Narrators are a little bit trickier because we have to consent once at the beginning of the process and it's very hard to withdraw it later. Mm-hmm. So we have to like either do that word search and look for problematic passages or try to read the whole book before we say yes, which can be really tough to do. But even
or sometimes
so, like,
impossible.
Or sometimes impossible before, like, you obviously read the whole book before you start recording, but sometimes you can't do it before you have to give a solid yes or no.
Sometimes they don't
even have it to give
to
you.
do an impossible. It's not economical. It would be so unfair to
Yeah.
expect us to read the whole book before starting.
Yeah, which is why like I just search for certain words to see if I can like jump to scenes that could potentially have a non-consensual encounter or whatever. But yeah, so that's one way I try to think about it when I think about those books existing. And I think there's another discussion to be had about like, is the volume of those stories increasing? Are those stories dominant in the market? Like, and the ramifications of that, because stories are still very powerful. But, you know, in terms of those books existing point blank, I'm like, well, if all the humans involved are on board, does it matter whether the characters are on board or not?
And also,
That's
is the
interesting.
fact that they exist as books, does it stop that stuff happening in real life, or does it encourage it?
That's the fear, isn't it, though? That, like, by contributing to the story, that you might be encouraging that behavior in a situation where it's not a fantasy. That's my fear.
I know the link between sexual harassment in the military, which is a very particular environment prone towards difficulty in this area, because it doesn't have an objective law court. Well, it does now, but it's still, well, anyway, there's loads of different reasons for it. But the fact that soldiers watch hardcore porn directly contributes to the rise of sexual assaults within these kind of environments. So it isn't society, but also when you're looking at, in the rise of AI, some sex robots, but they tested one in a conference, and within half an hour, it was broken and shattered because people were allowed to use it. And I go, okay, knock yourself out. And thank God you're not doing that on a real person. But it makes me think there might be a correlation. Like, how do you watch that? How do you start to watch that? And how would you even, and should you even shut it down?
Yeah, I wonder though with things like the military, how much I'd be interested to know like how much their viewing habits contribute versus how much like the hierarchical structure of the army, the patriarchal structure, the misogyny that's inherent and you know like I think that there's a lot of factors. And that's not to say I'm like everybody should be just watching nonstop hardcore porn because there's a lot of porn that's made really unethically. There's a lot of people getting hurt. I mean, I'm not denying that there's like there's real problems here. And people can have problems with that kind of content. They can consume any kind of content to excess and have it affect their worldview. Right. Like, and that goes for sex related content and also like political content, other things like people can overindulge on content that is problematic or racist or sexist or whatever. And that can absolutely contribute to how they move through the world.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's difficult to really nail down decent research about that when everybody's different.
Yeah.
I wonder sort of with the general pornification of culture, though, that sexual drives and representation and sexual appetites and sexual mores are in one way opening up, but also in another way becoming more problematic. You know, if it can't be satiated because if you're watching it, then you want to do it in real life kind of thing. I haven't any data to back this up, but I have heard that it can change your impulses just even by casual watching of it.
I am curious when you talk about like the pornification of culture, what you're referring to or what your experience has been with that shift. Because honestly, like I think of when I would like get Harlequin like romances from the grocery store when I was a teenager in like the 90s and early 2000s. Lots of them, almost all of them had explicit non-consent. There was a lot of rape. There was a lot of rape happening in those books. Every single one I picked up. And it was like, she said no, like no. But then like he was so good at sex that by the end she was into it. Like that's usually the arc, but tons of those books. But I feel like now when I look at some of the mass market stuff, I feel like I'm seeing more diversity now. And that's not to say that those books don't exist. And it might also be because, like you said, you're doing a lot of historical, you're doing a lot of mainstream. that might be the bulk of the content that you're getting sent. But I'm curious what you've observed in terms of like an increase in that content more broadly.
I suppose I'm talking from a place of looking at culture more broadly and where audiobooks sit within it. Deanna was just talking about the pornification of culture and maybe if that sits within audiobooks. So I feel like whilst all the diversity in erotica is opened up is a good thing, I also feel like there is an appetite for faster, better, more, can't be, like an almost addictive quality to where the boundaries are and can be. And then it means, of course, each time it's like each time there's something that pops up that feels like a step back, there's also something that goes, no, this is a great opportunity to reaffirm boundaries and what safety is and look at choice. And but generally speaking, I feel the world is more accepting of, there's a general pornification of culture where you go, oh, I thought that was pop culture. And wait, this is for kids? Hang on a minute. Why are they dancing like that? Or, so it's not necessarily in audiobooks. And certainly I am naive about the ones outside historical romance and what's in erotica. And I'm glad that it's out there. I'm glad that it's out there showing what people desire and what people want. But the shadow side of it makes me nervous.
Well, we just live in a time where there's more, full stop, right? So any way you look, you can find what you're looking for. And so I think what it uncovers is actually just such a vast discrepancy of human experience and human interest and human desire. And so there's the lightest of light and the darkest of darks and everything in between, and sometimes both at the same time. And there's positives to that and negatives to that. And I think it is in publishing and in audiobooks as much as it's anywhere else in the world right now.
And if you try and stop stuff which you feel is unhealthy, or, I have a drive to be like, oh, God, no, how do we stop that? Because I'm constantly in other spaces that are really for zero tolerance and for rape survivors, especially those in the military. And just looking at how it proliferates just feels like, how do you take a jackhammer to this stuff which is so damaging, that's so accepted? So I'm probably a bit more, I just know that what rises up in me sometimes is a bit quick to dismiss those things. And I don't mean to dismiss you at all. But I'm always quick to be like, some of it's just wrong and bad. And it shouldn't be there.
Yes.
Argument.
I can't do this thing where I'm like, we should be open to it, because some of it I just find just beyond. And it does lead to real life shit,
Yeah. Listening to a lot of what y'all have been talking about, for some reason, the word glorification came to my mind. You know what I mean? Because we were talking about where is the line, and then you said boundaries. And is that what it is? Is it taking something that is taking power away from someone else, that is taking choice away from someone else, that is infringing on someone else's rights? And then the glorification of that behavior, whether it be the pornification of pop culture, whether it be non-consensual or rape culture. Like, is that what we're actually talking about? For lack of a better word, where we are raising up the villain of the piece for the villainy itself.
Right.
Yeah. Or the even, for me, the glorification's a good way to put it, because that is my line. When I'm looking at a project and whether or not I'm going to take it, I'm not going to say no to a book that has rape or sexual assault or some of the darker aspects of sex play or BDSM in it. I am going to say no if any of the non-consensual stuff in there is made to seem normal or okay, or like Lindsey was talking about, by the end of it, he's just so good at sex, it's fine that this started as sexual assault. Like, that's my line. I can't pretend like assault and non-consensual sex doesn't happen in the real world. And I'm okay with it showing up in literature as long as the reaction from the people in the book is what I consider, and this is my worldview, what I consider to be acceptable, which is a full stop.
Right.
We don't like that. That wasn't okay.
So for me, my experience in identity, right? The way most lives that would be connected to me, especially of my ancestors, it's always about the trauma of the thing. And so one of the things I would add to that, because I agree with you, Kirt, what I would add to that is I was like, well, what's the other side? What's the recovery? Like, how do they pull themselves out of wherever this situation has put them? Do you know what I mean? Like, what is the purpose? What is the why for this one thing, for this one moment to be in this book? And what's the after? And if I'm not
Yes.
part of the identification of growth or learning about someone's self, or rising from the ashes like whatever you want to call it, right? The rebirth. If I'm not part of that, if that's not part of the story, what's the whole point? Why am I here? Why is it here? Whatever this is, right? Was it non-consent? Was it rape? Like whatever the content is. And so yes, because the thing is like, for traumatic experiences, episodes, whatever, I think it's good for that content to be available so people who are untouched by it are aware that this is a possible real life situation for someone else. Because I think one of the things we haven't really touched on is the lack of empathy, right? Which is where I think some of the behaviors that come out of consuming some of this more aggressive content, I mean, that could be the connection, right?
Well, and it could be the difference, right, between like is it humanizing or is it dehumanizing? It's the
Exactly, exactly.
contextual thing. Yeah.
That's a
Yes,
great line, isn't
yes.
it? Just to go.
So I want to talk about like the other side of that, because in my own personal opinion, because of what the history of my ancestors is, all of that was built on the patriarchy and economics. And so what are the things that we can do, even artistically, that bring us into this realm of still providing that entertainment, because that's why most people are consuming this material, but providing not just the education, but the process of healing for those who need it.
Yeah, I think there's an integrity in that, because there's a responsibility that comes to bear if you're going to bring an audience through it for real. Not like a horror film might treat death, or like, like Anywhere might, or even I'm trying to think of the genre that The Gentleman is written in, but death is treated so lightly and we accept it within those things. But other kind of traumas, if you're really going to talk about them, then you're absolutely right. Why talk about it? What is your subtext as an author, unless you're going to see the effect on that person and keep their humanity, so they're not just a victim of some tragedy for the purposes of something that is lessening somehow. Yeah, you do have a responsibility, I think, as an author. It's like the difference between what the story is about, really, and what the story is saying. It could be about sexual assault, but what it's really saying is, here's a person who can't be diminished, sort of thing.
I just want to say, just what's rolling around in my head right now is that as we talk about this topic and the work that we do, it seems like we're kind of all of one mind about the types of work that we'll engage with. And yet we know that we have colleagues who do the types of work that we're saying we wouldn't engage with. And the reason they're doing that work is because the work exists, which means there's an audience for it, which means like there's a reason the art's being created. There's a reason that there are people buying it. Narrators need to do that work. Part of this whole thing that we do is making money. As much as I enjoy having these conversations and talking about these topics, I always worry too that like perspectives are missing. And just knowing that on this podcast episode, there's only 5 of us, and like there are voices that aren't being represented here. And I don't want to take away any agency from those people who aren't here to speak up from that perspective. We just don't have that perspective present here today, and acknowledging that.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's really well said. Yeah, I'm sorry if I came across too strong before or a bit inarticulately.
Please do not apologize, because everybody's perspective is valid, including yours, including mine, including Gail's and Deanna's and Lindsey's, and those people who aren't here to say what their perspective is.
It is a very nuanced topic, and these lines can be not very clear. Again, lines that might be clear in a real life scenario are less clear when we're talking about fiction and fantasy and all of these things. And it can be difficult to navigate that as individual narrator and like try to think through what our responsibility is as storytellers and what work we feel comfortable with and we don't. And maybe I'm being too open about the whole thing, but because obviously there's a clear line in terms of like, if it was non-consensual in a real life scenario, that is so clear that that's wrong and that's, horrible. But I also like the reason that I'm hesitant sometimes to like, again, I don't do this work because I don't like living in that world, as a narrator. But then I also think about like where people drew lines previously with sex acts that were foreign to them or were disgusting to them, where like queer sex could have been considered harmful to spread.
I was going to say, there are narrators who only do Christian romances who think what we're doing is harming the world.
Yeah.
Is sharing a worldview that's harmful to other people.
Right. Yeah. And part of my story is that like I have a pelvic pain disorder. So my relationship to like that part of my body and that part of my life has been very complicated. And I will say the power of fantasy and even fantasies that I would not want to occur in real life. Like there's some fantasies or some romances I read where I'm like, ooh, that would be great. And then of course there's some where I'm like, actually, I wouldn't want that to happen to me ever in real life. But reading about it, thinking about it, imagining it, helped me find something else, unlocked something within me that let me explore that part of myself that I struggled to do because I was dealing with this pain, and the pain and everything else was so mixed up. And it was really hard to like pull that apart, especially when you sort of see one idea, especially in fiction, one idea of what sex looks like, of what that progression is, of what counts as sex, that like, they're like, this happens and then this happens and then there's penetration and then she comes and like, sort of this blueprint that you see over and over and over and over and over again in pop culture and stories and whatever, and seeking out things that either in a fictional healthy way or sometimes a fictional unhealthy way deviated from that script helped me figure stuff out that was, and figure stuff out for myself because I didn't fall into that script. And that script never worked for me, and that script was only associated with pain. And so that's also why I tend to have, again, because, and I'm not saying like like I've said a million times in this podcast, I've said no to non-consensual romances before because I don't like living in that space as a performer. But when I think about like, is it bad that they exist? Is it bad that they, I'm like, it's because it could be unlocking something in somebody. And it could be allowing them to like find a way that is outside of the mainstream.
Yeah.
And
potentially.
What you're reminding me of is just how deeply personal sex is. It means something different to everyone. And everyone's relationship to sex is different depending on their background or their sexuality or their lack of sexuality. where they are in their life, who they spend time with. All of and even though sex can be commodified, it remains deeply personal. And so some of these lines that we draw for ourselves are so important to identify and to know, so that we don't take on work that will be harmful to us or that we think is harmful to others. But we can't look at somebody else's line and say, well, your line's wrong because it doesn't match my line.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, so in theater, there's this, whole concept, especially in musical theater, do it for the people in the back. So everyone can see and everybody can have the same experience, whether, they're sitting, center stage, or they're in the mezzanine. Do you know what I mean? Do it for the people in the back. So for me, when it comes to romance, it's about the love, right? Because I believe everyone deserves that, even love of self, if that's what the happy ever after is, right? A lot of contemporary romance, people will argue with me, but that is the whole point of some of those books, okay? So if you had your choice to just continue to do the romance that really speaks to you, share what that would be. For me, it's just all about the love. Like I say, even if that discovery and that acceptance of love is of oneself. But I would love to get anybody else's opinion on that, because this is the very last thing.
I think as somebody who, in my personal life, has always been attracted to the bad boy, and watching him come good in romance feeds potentially what we were talking about before. Like, does it create an unhealthy fantasy? I'm allowed to dip into it, so I don't do it in my real life anymore. So I like the ones that she finds it in herself to say no. And he misses her and comes back and reforms. It's true.
Yeah.
That says a lot. Probably says too much.
I look forward to moving forward in my career and seeing what you just identified for me, because I think you're right. And I think I'm going to discover that a lot of the projects I read are about discovering a love of self over a love of somebody else.
I was going to say discovering a deeper love of self through a love of somebody else, and them also realizing that. So like Lindsey and I co-narrated a book in Anita Kelly's series, where I felt like that was very much the situation, where they both came into it needing something in themselves and couldn't realize that until they found each other. And like that was the happily ever after of it. Or I just did this book, Maggie North book, that was like also this second chance romance. They were married for years and they were so unhappy, and it wasn't until they went off and took care of what they each needed in themselves and then like played with that through improv with each other that they like finally had this beautiful marriage and better relationship with self. And I think it's just that idea of that intimacy of exploration in a more journey kind of sense that makes me intrigued.
Yeah, and care and seeing yourself in someone else's eyes and allowing yourself to be cared for, I think can help with self-discovery and self-value and stuff. And not that your value is located in the other person or in their care for you, but through their care, they demonstrate your worthiness again to you. And, and you do the same to them.
I mean, what I think we've all just kind of touched on is maybe one of the reasons, besides, the love and just the connection and the firsts of romance that I really love, but it's the sometimes therapeutic process of not necessarily having to experience it, but like personally experience it, but experience it through someone else's story and come to those own realizations for yourself. It's kind of cool. Romance is cool, y'all. Whatever.
Yeah.
Amen.
So I'm so excited that you were here, Mary Jane. Thank you so much for being a guest
Thank
co-host. And I
Thank
thank
you.
all of y'all for joining us for this episode of the Narrator Roundtable. Now, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast. And that is where podcasts are. Okay, we are everywhere. We're on Audible, y'all. Apple, Spotify, Google. Yes. And we are also on YouTube, so you can see our pretty faces, right? So subscribe. Thank you. If you want to join the conversation, find us on social media. We're on TikTok, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook and Twitter, y'all. So you can also visit the website, that's narratorroundtable.com, to submit a question or a topic for discussion for any future episode. Because we want to know what's on your mind, because we definitely want to talk about it, because we have such a good time. Thank y'all. Appreciate you. Take care.
The Narrator Roundtable is produced and hosted by André Santana, Deanna Anthony, Gail Shalan, Kirt Graves, and Lindsey Dorcus. All copyrighted material is shared with permission. Music and sound effects are licensed through Storyblocks Audio. All opinions shared are those of the individuals and do not reflect the positions or policies of any company or organization with which they happen to be associated.